What follows will be our second lecture video on Impressionism. If you recall, the Impressionists, the group that would be christened the Impressionists, and they would accept that label, held their first exhibition in 1874, and there were seven subsequent exhibitions, 8 in all, through the year 1886. Many of the paintings that I'll be showing you today were exhibited at one or more of those exhibitions. Some weren't. And I want to touch on a number of influences that are evident in the work of these artists. We're first looking here at a work by Monet, which was exhibited in 1877. This is one of 7 or 8 paintings that he made of the Gare Saint-Lazare. This was the train station, one of several big train stations, this one on the northwestern side of Paris. Many of the Impressionists lived in the vicinity. Monet arranged permission to be able to move about freely among the railroad tracks and did a number of paintings of this setting. As a subject, this is the very embodiment of modernity. Railroad lines, railroad stations were a relatively new part of the landscape of Paris. We're looking here at a shed structure made of iron with a big skylight in the center of it. There are a few people, but in addition there are trains which are puffing smoke and steam into the air. And so clearly what Monet is interested in here is the effects of light and atmosphere that result from the veils of smoke and steam that alter the appearance of things around. Those are big buildings of 6 or 7 stories in height in the distance. But we know buildings of that size to be substantial, weighty items, but they look like they're made of nothing because of the particular lighting effects of this moment. The technique is painterly, the colors are bright. This is very much in keeping with the nature of Impressionism style and the interest of the Impressionists in contemporary subject matter. I show you here one other example of a painting from this group. This is called Le Pont de l'Europe. I'll pull the title up here, you can see below. Gare Saint-Lazare, meaning Europe Bridge. The Europe Bridge, this is a roadway that passes over the top of the train yard. And again, we see buildings in the distance. The smoke and steam are closer to us so that they break up the expanse of the picture plane into areas of white painterly strokes and the objects beyond that we see then in the distance. One of Monet's contemporaries was the painter Gustave Caillebotte. Caillebotte was wealthy. His father had made a fortune selling beds and linen to the French army. Caillebotte earned a degree as a lawyer. He didn't have to sell anything, but he had ambitions as a painter and became involved with the Impressionists at the time of their second exhibition. His financial resources allowed him to be an organizer and a patron for the group, often paying for the rental of the spaces they used to exhibit, and acting as an organizer to pull all the different energies and resources together and make the exhibition happen. This painting, which is called Paris Street Rainy Weather, was exhibited in 1877 at the occasion of the third exhibition, and it was the biggest and most attention-getting work in the exhibition. A large work, unusually large for an Impressionist painting. It is 6 feet 9 inches by 9 feet 9 inches. So the figures that we see here are depicted about life size. This depicts an intersection in the newly renovated, newly um, newly transformed landscape of Paris. Uh, Under the Emperor Napoleon III, the prefect Baron Haussmann had been put in charge of a massive renovation of the city. Large parts of the medieval architectural fabric of Paris was torn down, and uh, these long, straight boulevards converging at focal points. We could call this a Bolivium. They were laid out with new buildings of about 6 stories in height with the monotonous uniform facades that you see here in the distance. You'll notice that there are firewalls at intervals that were included in the design to break up the spread of fire. So this is the new Paris. And again, this image is very much one of the contemporary scene and contemporary experience. Um, on a rainy, dreary day, we see strollers moving about. They're all holding umbrellas, and the umbrella itself was a fairly new object adopted by Parisians in imitation of the English, who had been using umbrellas for some time. Caillebotte puts us on the sidewalk. He puts us among the pedestrians that are directly in front of us here on the right-hand side of the painting. And it looks as if somebody's going to have to step out of the way, we the viewer or them, in order to allow the other to pass. So it's as if a moment, an instant in contemporary urban experience has been frozen here. And the instantaneous look of the painting is furthered by the pedestrian. The cut off here in the middle, we see exactly half of this man's body, and by the strolling positions of the figures. In some cases, they overlap one another in a way that is a bit confusing, intentionally clumsy. One pedestrian overlapping another, overlapping the carriage. There are also some interesting juxtapositions of near and far, as when the maidservant back here, stepping out of a door on an errand, she's opening an umbrella, is seen next to the woman in the foreground, and you can see that her whole body is the height of just the face of the woman in front. The diminishing size of figures from foreground to middle ground to distance, along with the linear perspective employed in the representation of these buildings, establishes a very powerful sense of depth in space. The style here is a little different from Monet's and the other Impressionists in being more refined, more finished. We could call this perhaps a realist style rather than an Impressionist style, but the interest in contemporary urban subject matter is very much in keeping with Impressionism. And as I said earlier, Caillebotte participated in the Impressionist exhibitions. So from an institutional point of view, he's very much a part of that movement. We're looking here at another painting of the urban Parisian scene. This is by Camille Pissarro, who in the 1890s established a studio in Paris and painted a number of views like this, which look down from balconies or high vantage points on the city below. And what we see here, you'll notice, seems really quite random. There is no focal point in the center. The figures are scattered about. They are anonymous. There's a sense of movement in every direction. So it's as if we're seeing, again, a frozen moment in contemporary experience. Pissarro's technique is in keeping with Impressionism, dabs of paint evident throughout in the painterly manner in which the work was executed. Other painters that exhibited with this group were more interested in social interaction and the human figure. And one of those is Renoir, whose painting of Le Moulin de la Galette is seen here. I'll pull that title up, The Dance at the Moulin de la Galette. This dates from 1876. Um, the place, Le Moulin, the mill of the Galette, was located on the hill of Montmartre to the north above the city of Paris. And this was a place where particularly working class people went on a day off to dance, to converse, to eat and drink, doing the very things that we're seeing here. This is quite a large painting at 4 feet 3 inches by 5 feet 8 inches. And this is Renoir's most ambitious effort in painting the human figure in outdoor light, using the kind of patchy painterly technique that he adopted, in keeping with the Impressionist experiments of Monet and others. You'll notice that Renoir's brushwork is a little bit different. I like to compare it to cotton candy. We can see here in the back of this figure, it's turned away from us. So what we're seeing is light passing through the canopy of foliage overhead, and it results in this mottled look on his jacket with the lighter spots showing where sunlight comes through. The same sort of cotton candy look appears on other clothing on the ground over here. Now, a painting this size could not have been executed on the spot, but no doubt Renoir made studies. He might have made some small-scale sketches and then assembled that information into the large finished view that we see here in the studio. Again, there's a certain randomness about the composition. There is no major motif, but a variety of focal points. I would say the women here, maybe the young man on this side, the dancing couple that looks towards us over here, but these things are scattered about, and they're more or less equal in prominence to one another. It's as if he simply held up the frame, and he has represented what happened to fall within that border, and the frame then shifted over a foot or two in one direction or another. You would have seen something equally interesting. And we're looking here at a painting that's not in your textbook by Edgar Degas, another painter within this group who was interested in urban subject matter, particularly in people and movement and social interaction. And this painting is entitled, usually it's called L'Absinthe. L'Absinthe. Now, absinthe is the drink that sits on a table in front of the woman. It is highly alcoholic, a very powerful drink, which is, I believe, forbidden now. It's greenish in color, just as you see, and it is typically thinned with water. A carafe of water sits here to the degree that the drinker wishes. Sitting next to her is a man whose elbow is next to a drink that's been identified as Mazagrin, which is a combination of coffee and seltzer water. Cold coffee and seltzer water was often consumed at this time as a corrective for hangover. So it looks as if this is early morning. The woman has perhaps been drinking all night. She looks wasted to that degree. And Degas has depicted them as if they were seen and quickly captured in this image from a table nearby within the cafe. Notice that the table here in the foreground, where Degas has signed his name, it really suggests the location of, well, we're put there as a viewer, and it suggests the location of the painter who saw this. The result then is a highly asymmetrical composition with the figures pushed into the upper right-hand corner and a pattern, an interesting pattern of zigzagging lines seen in the marble tabletops and in this newspaper that forms a bridge between two tabletops, leading us up to the figures in the upper right. Now, you could say that the subject here is one of sort of human degradation, a woman that has drunk herself into oblivion, not something that you would see in earlier art, particularly in anything classicizing or idealizing. But Degas thought this a worthy subject an interesting view of human behavior in the city. Uh, as I've established, it's set up as if this is something he saw and even portrayed on site. In fact, it was done in the studio. He had marble tabletops there that he could use as props. So it's very carefully calculated there in the studio in order to look casual and formal, quickly observed, quickly recorded. And here a painting by Manet, which dates from 1882 to 83. Uh, Remember, Manet painted Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe. He was an influence on the Impressionists, never exhibited with them. But when I began talking about Manet, I remarked that he influenced them, and in turn, they influenced him, particularly in the last decade of his career, when when he took up the subject of urban leisure in works such as this. And this is a big work, really his last ambitious work. The size is 3 feet by 4 feet. It was done in the studio, and like the Degas, it was it recorded the sites at a favorite night spot that he himself went to. He had a model come to his studio, an actual barmaid, and pose for him there. And so, in a studio setting, he has created this view of Parisian nightlife, a kind of a vignette of Parisian nightlife, um, and done so in a way that looks immediate, actual. It looks like we might be there. Now, what is depicted here? Again, the title, A Bar at the Folies Bergère. Well, the Folies Bergère was a night spot that was rather luxurious, and I believe there was a cover charge to get in. There was not one bar, but many bars around the periphery of the room. And so we're looking at one of those bars, which is staffed by a single serving woman. And we see her standing behind her bar with beer and bottles of champagne and fruit, creme, the mint. Some of these things are still available for sale. This is Bass Ale, for example, here. All these things scattered across the marble tabletop in front. Then behind her, we see a mirror, the frame of which is down here, so that most of the painting contains reflected imagery, those things that are across the Folies Bergère from this woman. We see gas lamps here, lots of people enjoying themselves. And notice up here is a trapeze and the legs of the performer. The Folies Bergère was a place where there was rather elaborate, rather spectacular performance activity on stage. So what Manet has done is to paint as the main subject here a peripheral figure, a peripheral detail from this place. And he has put what would have been central in the Folies Bergère, had you been there, that is the performance activity, into the periphery of the painting. A clever inversion. You'll notice that there's a reflection here of the woman, apparently, and a male customer. Now, the pose is a little different. The figure that we see in the center is standing upright. This woman seems to lean forward a little bit, so there's a little disjunction. The customer that she's speaking to or responding to, would have to be standing in front of the bar. So we're in the position of that person. We become the top-headed male customer. The reflection is wrong. If the mirror is parallel to the picture plane, then the reflection of the woman ought to be directly behind her. And we know that Manet experimented with the location of these things because there's a study for this painting which locates the figure more correctly, although not absolutely correctly, behind her. However, if he was to put the figure or the reflection behind her, then her hourglass figure would be obscured, and he seems to want to emphasize that. And maybe also to create a disjunction between her behavior here in responding in a more relatable way to the male customer, and her rather distant look here. What does this mean? Um, Here's a detail of that figure's face. You can see the way she's painted here. I think I have one more. No, just the one detail. You'll notice that she looks distant. She looks as if she's perhaps exhausted, tired. Her mind has wandered um, from her work. She's not responding uh, um, with engagement to the male customer. That seems rather distant. Um, One way that this has been interpreted, I think, rather interestingly, is that in the city of Paris, growing larger in size, it was about 1.5 million by this time. Um, as we all know, if you've been to New York City or Chicago, you walk down the street and you rarely meet somebody's eyes. Uh, uh, Ironically, we're, 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 we're anonymous. The more people that we're among, because it's really, frankly, impossible to engage everybody around you when you're in a crowd as large as a big city. Um, so a male customer might have stepped up to the bar and expected to have his identity, maybe his masculinity, affirmed by an attractive young woman. But what you get instead is distance, separation. This is increasing the experience of being in a big city. Um, that's a possible interpretation, and I think an interesting one. Another that I've read that I found rather moving, frankly, in a book that wasn't much good otherwise, but it was suggested that this might be seen as a kind of alter ego of Manet himself, who was at this time dying. Um, he painted this with great effort. People came to watch him paint for a while because he knew and they knew that he was dying. And so this is Manet looking out on the glittering, colorful world of Paris and Paris entertainment that he so much loved, but realized that it was all going away for him very quickly. That look of slight melancholy on the figure's face might be associated with Manet's own outlook and his prospects. Now he has signed a painting down here. You can see it in the lower left-hand corner on a beer bottle. And this is interesting because we all know that an alcoholic drink affects our outlook on the world. An intoxicant alters our view of things. And art does the same thing. Art, a deep experience of art, a kind of epiphany or an awakening of the sort that art can create for us, it changes our view of the world. And so perhaps that was an intentional association as well. Um, Manet's paintings are full of clever things like this. Remember Olympia and Le Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, and the way those two paintings took works from the past and transformed them in witty and interesting ways. We're looking here again at the work of Degas, Edgar Degas, who is perhaps best known for his paintings of dancers, of ballerinas. But unless you stop and really look closely at a painting like this, you may not realize that he rarely paints the performance, but rather it's dance rehearsals. It's what goes on in the practice rooms. Degas had free access to the practice rooms at the Paris Opera, and he would come and go. There he would make sketches of motifs, poses that he found interesting, and then he would work with those in the studio to create a kind of composite view. Again, this is a studio painting. It is very carefully calculated, based on numerous studies, but made to look as if it was captured on the spot. Well, he puts us, it seems, on the periphery of the room. And in the corner of the room, there is a circular staircase that leads upstairs. You can see the legs of dancers here, one descending the staircase. The staircase cuts off the body of another dancer. We see figures not only dancing, but also stretching, waiting. Here is a mother who is attending to the attire of another dancer and the ballet instructor in the background. The composition is highly asymmetrical, with an empty center and the various figures pushed to the periphery of the work. Of all the Impressionists, Degas was most interested in the past, and particularly in the classical tradition, as exemplified by Ingres, the painter of the Apotheosis of Homer, and other classical artists. Important, and let me show you, you should remember this work by Ingres, the Grand Odalisque, a painting of a recumbent female nude, but an exotic figure, an odalisque, uh, um, associated with a harem in Turkey. Um, we could call this a display nude. She's aware of being seen. Her body is put on display, quite conspicuously. And you'll remember that Ingres has transformed the body, has idealized the body in ways so that you've got long, undulating lines on the contours of the form. Um, Blemishes, shadows, details are suppressed. For example, no real wrist, and only the slightest suggestion of an elbow, the slightest suggestion of a spine, so as to achieve the smooth surfaces and continuous lines that we see in this idealized figure. Now, Degas was also interested in the female nude. This is a work called The Tub by him, and it dates from 1886. It's a work in pastel. Now, pastel, this is something like chalk, although his pastels were oil-based. So it's essentially a drawing tool, not a painting. And you can see the individual marks made by the pastel crayon, for example, in the highlight on the back here. Degas has depicted the nude, however, in a very different way from the display nude of Ingres. This is a figure who is absorbed in the daily activity, hygienic activity of bathing. Degas is responding intentionally or maybe coincidentally to the call by a prominent critic of the time, by Baudelaire, to paint modern life and to paint the nude where one would see the nude, in the anatomical theater, in a brothel, in bathing. That's what he's done here. She's absorbed in the activity and so is completely unaware of a viewer. She is posed, she is seen, in Degas' words, as if seen through a keyhole. It's as if we're a voyeur looking through a keyhole into the room. And in contrast to the Ingres, you could say this pose is an awkward one, but it's an actual one. It reflects the way people of the time really did bathe. That is, in a shallow tub. She's crouched down so as not to splash water outside the tub. And this puts the body in a kind of accordion-like folding pose that is much less flattering than Ingres' Grand Odalisque. On the right-hand side here is a tabletop, perhaps, or a shelf, along which are hygienic items, items of toiletry, such as the pair of scissors and a brush and pitchers. And you'll notice, if you look carefully, that these are very strategically placed to echo the shapes of the body. So, for example, the V of the scissors is echoed in the V formed by the foot and the leg. The way the brush handle sticks off the table edge is echoed in the hand that supports the body. The table edge on a slight diagonal is paralleled by the arm, which is on exactly the same slight diagonal. The handles and the bottoms of the pitchers, forming a kind of a figure eight or half of a figure eight, is echoed in the head and the tub. So there are many, many of these formal resonances, echoes that connect one part of the painting to the other and create a really beautifully, elegantly unified composition. Now, this odd point of view that we have on the tabletop is one that may be, it may bear the influence of Japanese prints on Degas, which he indeed saw. Let me bring up here a pair of images. Whoops. Okay, here's the Japanese print. All right, now prints of this kind began to come to Paris maybe around 1860. And this was the result of Commodore Matthew Perry the American sea captain opening up Tokyo Harbor, forcing the government there to engage in trade with the outside world. Um, and as a result, Japanese art objects, things like screens and kimonos and fans and prints, lacquered furniture, these things began to be exported to Western locations and collected avidly by people interested in the art of faraway places. Many artists in Paris collected Japanese things, Whistler and Monet did, Degas, Toulouse-Lautrec, and others. And these artists were fascinated by these prints and the very different way of depicting their subjects that were really quite alien, quite different from Western art. You'll notice, for example, that there is no modeling of the human figure. The face is outlined, and there are a few details that are indicated, but no shading that would give the sense of the roundness of the form. Likewise with the figure over here. There is no linear perspective either, and often backgrounds appear as here with equal clarity as the foreground. Bright colors are used, and you'll see that that outlined shapes, boldly outlined shapes, are filled in with bright color, and there's no modulation, no gradation in the color from side to side, as there might be as there would be in most Western works. So artists were fascinated by these very different stylistic traits, and they influenced the way they saw and depicted the world. So, for example, the tabletop, which seems to almost rise really straight up rather than back in space. This suggests a very different perspective, a different notion of space, which may result from Degas looking at Japanese prints. Now, very definitely, the American painter Mary Cassatt, who lived in France most of her life, closely associated with Degas. Degas gave her advice at different times. She was influenced by Japanese prints. And so we're seeing here her painting, this is in your textbook, of The Child's Bath. It dates from 1893. This is an oil on canvas. Our point of view is steeply downward onto the interaction of these figures. And this creates a kind of a flatness in the way one patterned area, the rug here, is juxtaposed against the patterned wallpaper and chest behind. Prominent among the patterns is that of the woman's dress, which is rather little modeled as well. The lines of the dresses just simply move about in space, back and forth from side to side of the canvas. Women painters at this time still were limited in some ways. Mary Cassatt could not enter the School of the Fine Arts, the government-sponsored art institution in Paris. She could exhibit at the Salon. She could not study the nude figure. And at least according to the institutions at the time, that was a fundamental experience in one's training, which would lead to the painting of large-scale historical subjects. So if one couldn't study the nude figure, one really couldn't aspire to undertake large-scale history paintings of that kind. Mary Cassatt found her subjects, particularly in the in women's domestic activities, reading, having tea together, interactions between mother and child, as you see here. And the same is true of Berthe Morisot, another female painter of the time. Both of those artists, Morisot and Cassatt, exhibited with the Impressionists. I want to show you a few examples of Impressionist portraiture. By and large, Renoir was one who did fulfill commissions for portraits, but by and large, the Impressionists painted their friends. They painted each other. They painted their family members, perhaps, but they did not. They were not frequently engaged as portrait painters. And the way, when they did paint portraits, they did so in a rather different way. This is by Manet, and it depicts the writer and art critic Emile Zola. The contents of the image are quite interesting. We see Zola basically full length, but of course seated. He's holding a book. He was a writer, so this is appropriate. Writing instruments are on the table in front of him. Zola had written a pamphlet that was supportive, appreciative of Manet's art in the 1860s. This portrait was made in 1868, probably partly as an expression of appreciation by Manet for Zola's support. And notice that that pamphlet is seen here. The word Zola and then Manet is below. So by including the portrait, it becomes the title of the work and the signature of the artist. Manet's name is there on the pamphlet. It's nowhere else in the form of a signature. Zola was apparently interested in Japanese art. We see a folding screen behind him, and here a print. And here is a black and white photograph of Manet's painting Olympia above. Another example here is Manet's portrait of the writer-poet Stéphane Mallarmé. You notice that he does not seem to be posing, but rather engaged in thought and reading in thought. His hand is holding his place in a book. There's a lit cigar in his hand, but he's looking away reflectively, as if pondering the contents of the book. He's kind of slouched in a very informal way against a pillar on a wall, and the whole thing is executed in a very loose, free, painterly fashion. And here, a last portrait, in this case by Degas, of Henri Rouart in front of his factory. Now, Rouart was a factory owner and an engineer, a close friend of Degas from their teenage years in school together. And so Degas puts him in his environment. In the yard outside the factory, there are train tracks that lead to the factory itself. And he's very wittily echoed the shape of the man's top hat in the factory chimneys in the background. You'll notice the degree of finish here varies considerably from the face, which is shown in substantial detail with brushstrokes blended together, and yet the setting and even the man's jacket is very broadly, sketchily brushed in. Another interest on the Impressionists was music, and to talk about that, I'm showing you an image which is. So this is not in your textbook. I had to check. Another work by Whistler is there. This work is entitled by Whistler Symphony in White, number 3, 1867. Now, why would he label a work as symphony? Well, Whistler used musical titles for a number of works. He was interested in the analogy between music and painting. And I'm going to read you what he wrote about that. He said, as music is the poetry of sound, so is painting the poetry of sight. And the subject matter has nothing to do with harmony of sound or color. So he seems to be de-emphasizing subject matter and rather emphasizing form. He said the great musicians knew this. Beethoven and the rest wrote music, simply music, symphony in this key, concerto or sonata in that. On F or G, they constructed celestial harmonies, as combinations, evolved from the chords of F or G and their correlatives. He says this is pure music as distinguished from airs, meaning songs. He says art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear without confounding this with emotions foreign to it, such as devotion, pity, love, patriotism, and the like. All right, what Whistler is doing in that statement is de-emphasizing the importance of subject matter, of narrative, and the emotions that they might convey to a viewer or arouse in the viewer, like patriotism or devotion. He could care less about that. What he's interested in is harmony of form. And if you look at this, you'll notice that there are two female figures, but they really are, they have nothing to do with each other. They're not talking and not looking at each other. They're just simply posed in a way that apparently Whistler regarded as harmonious, with the arm of one figure along the top of this sofa, the other on the seat. They look in different directions. They wear clothing that connects them with what looks like perhaps a sheet or blanket covering the furniture. Um, he seems to view these women as simply beautiful forms, along with a Japanese fan. He was a collector on the floor, and an azalea bush in blossom. These are all beautiful things that are arranged in a harmonious fashion. There is no narrative here. There is no interaction that we need to decode to understand. Um, his interest is purely in harmony of form. And because he saw music functioning that way, for example, a symphony, often the title will be just Symphony in C or Symphony Number 3. It doesn't depict anything in particular. If it appeals to us, it's just the logic of sounds unfolding in time. Likely, if this appeals to us, Whistler sought to achieve that through the harmony of shapes and colors in space. All right, the last thing I want to talk to you about is Monet's paintings from the 1890s, when he began to paint in series. He painted a number of subjects in this way. Haystacks, he did 20 to 30 paintings of that subject. Poplars along a river, and here a cathedral facade. He began to realize that that the light on something changes frequently, and that if he was to undertake a painting on plein air, out of doors, in front of the subject, that in fact, from 1 hour to the next, the light might change significantly. And so to record different harmonies of light on a subject, he began painting a series of exactly the same subject. And if I show you a few examples here, you'll note that we see virtually exactly the same fragment of this cathedral facade located in Rouen. The title is found here, Rouen Cathedral, the portal meaning that he gave the door in sun. Now, to go about this, he went about it rather systematically. He rented a room across the square from the cathedral. He could open the windows wide and have at his ready there maybe 8, 10, a dozen canvases. He would work on one only as long as the light stayed more or less the same. And when he detected a change, then he would pull out another canvas. The next day, when the angle of the sun, when the height of the sun in the sky would be about the same, he might return to a canvas that he had painted on a previous day and to work further on that composition. So his response here is optical. He's recording what he sees and trying to capture the nuances of light and shadow and color as accurately as he can. But he used the word sensation. He was trying to capture his sensations. And I think we can see that some of these color harmonies don't seem entirely realistic. And that may be because Monet's emotions are coloring his sensations. And so you get more fiery, less naturalistic arrangements of color, as seen here in this view, Rouen Cathedral facade, or in this one. It's particularly that middle view that looks unnaturalistically colorful, intense in color. He did 25, 30, 35 of these, a large number of them, and they were all exhibited at the same time. So if you went to the exhibition, in this case at a private gallery, what you would see is one cathedral facade after another, after another, after another. Clearly, it was the experience of all of them that was the point. And what you saw was the changing harmonious patterns of light and shadow and color in light and atmosphere on a particular subject as the sequence of color unfolded through the day's time. In the end, you might say that that collection of works all on display together was a kind of symphony. That is, a symphony in the sense of a large-scale work. Symphonies have 4 movements. They might last a half an hour in time, but they're big works. And in experiencing a symphony or in seeing these cathedrals, one sees a kind of sequence of experiences, visual or oral, unfolding in time. This work, I would say, particularly because the coloring is so extreme, I think really takes us beyond Impressionism into the realm of what might be called post-Impressionism, art that is no longer realistic, naturalistic, but is altered by an emotional content. Um, by this time, the painters that we regard as post-impressionist, Seurat, Bezout, they were producing works, um, um, and um, and that will be our next subject. Post-impressionism. We'll take up those two painters in the next video.